Good rising, brethren. This is Big Judah coming to you guys from California. Before I begin, give all praises to the Most High Yahweh. Acknowledgement to the earthly mother. Who is wisdom? Who is the Holy Spirit? Acknowledgement to Yahushai. I pray the Most High blesses this lesson this evening. Gives more knowledge and understanding of the events of the past in order to understand events that are currently happening on the earth. So we get a much better understanding of the things that are soon to come on the earth. Brethren, we're going to get into part 3 of this video right here. And I went back a little bit, and he was talking about how when slave owners would go into the church and bring their slaves behind them, and how what the question was posed was, what can you teach? You know, in that environment, what is it that you can teach? And see, this is why these churches only teach very small amounts of what's actually in the scriptures. They have a certain dogma that they can teach. So that's why they can't teach very much. That's why they can't get into certain scriptures. They can't get breakdowns. They can only go on certain parts that substantiate, or they can twist to substantiate their society. How this gospel is for everyone. How we're all equal, but we're never treated equal in their society. When you have a whole umbrella, like you talked about in part 2, of everybody that came over here, that came from these different countries, were under the umbrella of being white. So therefore, but then they're trying to say that everybody's equal. But these churches know that white is on top and everybody else, black and brown, are at the bottom. So it's a very delicate mix. And then talking about having to pay for, what has happened to our people is something they definitely don't want to talk about. But this all still goes back to 2 Corinthians 11:4. And they come preaching another Jesus. Because they come and teach, they're not teaching the volume of the book. They're only teaching little fragments and then giving you stories. That's why when you are in church, or you were in church, they would read a couple of verses and then they would pontificate for another 45 minutes to an hour, just running their mouths and talking about absolutely nothing. That's why they're always telling you stories, giving you, telling you some jokes. Because as far as substance, there's none in these churches. So I went back just a little bit, and he talks about the mark of Cain. And that's all part of us losing our identity. Psalms 83. They took away our position as being the sons and daughters of the Most High, and gave us the history of the mark of Cain. And the whole world has been complicit because they've all been quiet. They're like, yeah, you guys are marked. You guys are marked for slavery. You have the mark of Cain, and that's a worldwide. But that's okay, because now the Most High is showing otherwise. Now let's take a listen here.
Environment, what scriptures would get read and which ones would absolutely not get read in that environment. It tells you a lot about the early shape of lived Christianity in the country, and that legacy that was built there, for centuries, not surprisingly, is still with us today. I mean, we've hardly begun to reform the theology. And just one example here, a biblical one. This text of that was used well into the 20th century about the mark of Ham or the mark of Cain, which what
he's talking about, it's still used now. They make it sound like it hasn't been used anymore. They still use it now. That's all part of their mentality, keeping us at the bottom. We're marked. We have the mark of Cain, and in there, what is it? The sons of Adam, right? Sons of Abel. They are the ones that are just, above reproach. But look at their actions. Does their actions show that they are the descendants of Abel, the chosen seed, the loving seed of the Most High, the ones that have been coming to bring knowledge, understanding to the world? It doesn't seem that way. Not at all.
Really did, again, reinforce this white supremacist worldview. And the way it went was this, that the explanation for the existence of dark-skinned people in the world can be traced to this story of Cain murdering his brother Abel. And when God comes and says, what's happened to your brother? And he sort of first denies it, but then God finally pins him down and says, okay, you've killed your brother. And he marks Cain. And the text really doesn't say anything about skin color. He just says that he gives him a mark. It doesn't say anything other than that. But white Christians and clergy began to interpret that passage as the origin of dark-skinned people in the world. Now, what that does, right, is it then gives white Christians one lineage that goes back to Adam and Eve, that is a very noble one, right? That of people that the Creator formed with the Creator's own hands. And the origin of dark-skinned people in the world is a criminal act. Yeah. It is literally the murder of one's own brother. And so there is this kind of tracing the lineage back to not to an original being that the Creator crafted with their own with the Creator's own hands, but with someone who created a criminal act, and then that justified then this moral hierarchy, even, right? That whites had this kind of more noble history. Dark-skinned people had this morally suspect history, and then you just read that into the current thing. There's many others I could give, but I mean, I think those were, I think to the modern ear, some that may sound a little ridiculous, but it was. I mean, this was well into the 20th century. You can find these passages being cited in exactly this way.
Yeah, and that does go back to Psalms 83, how they've all come together. And they've all given us a new lineage. The lineage we got now switched from being the sons and daughters from the line of Abel, and we got it switched to now we're the sons and daughters from the line of Cain. And who did that? These white pastors. And I'm sure the Catholic Church did exactly the same thing. These religions. So when they sit and talk about us bringing up color and everything else, why is it all about color? That's exactly what you guys did. So don't sit here and say when we bring it up now that we're the ones bringing up color. This was brought up way before us. This was used to justify all the horrible things you did to our people. So don't make it seem like this was all of a sudden us bringing up color. This is all about your churches and your institutions. And if you're still following them, you're still following that exact same lie. You don't get to say, this is not an, oh, I'm sorry kind of a thing that you can just fix it like that. This is what's been happening. This is justification for all the horrible things that have happened to our people for the last few hundred years. And you guys want to barely have a conversation after you've been, so we can't trust you. Because you don't want a conversation. You want a conversation that leads you to staying on top. That's the only conversation you guys want. You guys staying in power. And the Most High isn't about that.
Well, it's not lost on me that even this summer, the Baptist Calvinists, like, Tom Nettles and Albert Mohler, not at the seminary that you went to, but Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, who suggest that for enslaved peoples to run away was immoral on Christian grounds. And that's 2020. And they're still arguing and contending.
Yeah, I mean, last month too, Eric Metaxas, who's one of the best-selling authors in the evangelical world, was with a straight face arguing that Jesus was white. Mm-hmm. I mean, on Twitter was having this epic battle about Jesus being white, literally, which is clearly an odd thing for someone who's a biblical literalist to say. But given that what the Bible does say about his origins, the Middle Eastern Jew, but nonetheless, this was the argument that was being made. Yeah, exactly, in 2020. So it's really.
So these people haven't changed. Talking about making it seem as if a slave ran away, that was immoral. And they're still talking about trying to prove that Jesus is white. One of their best-selling, people was still having, still talking about Jesus being white. So like I said, these people are going to continue with the lies until the wheels fall off, until the Most High comes and shows them otherwise. And like I said, the Middle Eastern, now like I said, that wasn't even a place. The people that live there now aren't the ones that were there back then. They make it seem as if these people have always been there, or the ones that just got there in 1940s are the ones that were in the Bible, which we know are not true. But like I said, it is what it is. They're going to continue with the lies, and these people are going to try to. You got to get one group of people say, "Well, yeah, we don't believe that anymore. We don't believe that anymore." Yeah, right. Yeah, most of you guys do. You still believe that white is right, black is at the bottom, and everything else.
Not that far back there.
So let's talk about the racial attitudes of whites today and this racism index that you have created. Like, tell us about that.
Yeah, all right. I want to put on my social science hat.
Yeah.
So at the heart of the book, I think is trying to figure out how does this show up for us today, right? So it's one thing to kind of tell this history, even if it's very recent history, as we've been talking about, but how can we really think about measuring this legacy and again, kind of maybe testing it for the DNA, kind of its existence in the DNA of white Christianity today. So it's a little bit challenging with public opinion data to measure kind of racist attitudes because you can't exactly ask people directly about that. But what I did was I built what I called a racism index that is a collection of 15 different questions. So it's a lot of questions, more than a dozen questions that cover a lot of different ground. Everything from the police treatment of African Americans, criminal kind of disproportionate sentencing in the criminal justice program, the system, the economic mobility, all kinds of other kinds of structural racism issues. And what I found in that there is this massive gap among whites, and I think I'll start there. This gap between whites, those on the one hand who claim to be Christian of any kind. I mean, so not just evangelical, but who claim to be mainline Protestant Christian, and those are kind of the more liberal end of the white Protestant world, like Episcopalians, Presbyterians, United Methodists, and white Catholics who have their own history of discrimination in the country. But what I found was, so I scored this index on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 holding the least racist attitudes and 10 holding the most racist attitudes. And what I found is that white evangelicals, again, who have been heavily, in the South, perhaps not surprisingly, scored 8 out of 10 on this racism index. But what's maybe more surprising than that is that white mainline Protestants and white Catholics scored 7 out of 10 on this racism index. And if you look at whites who are not Christian, now I think this really shows
8 and 7, pretty much hella racist. Catholics, evangelicals, hasn't changed. They're the same. Like we always say, they're the same thing. White supremacist, racist. All these different Christians, Catholic churches. But let's hear what he says here about the people who are not in churches.
You the work that Christianity's doing. If you look at whites who are not Christian, they only score 4 out of 10 on this, and African Americans are at 2, right? So if you ask the question, like, who is closer to the views of African Americans on these questions of systemic racism, their experiences of systemic racism, white Christians are not the answer. Whites who are not Christian is the answer to that question. And it turns out that this is actually quite a robust relationship. That even when I controlled, for example, for a bunch of other possible alternative explanations, so maybe it's that they're more Republican, And that's why this correlation exists. Or maybe it's because they live in more rural areas. Maybe it's education levels. Maybe it's gender. Maybe it's region of the country. I check for all kinds of this, and even controlling for all of those factors. This independent relationship between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as white and Christian holds up. So it tells you that it's actually the Christianity piece that is doing the work. And just one more, I think, piece on this that was, I think, surprising is that I think you might also think, okay, well, maybe it's just these people are just Christian in name only. So maybe they don't really go to church. Maybe they haven't been discipled, or they're not in worship services just claiming to be Christian. But even when I looked at attendance patterns, what I found is that at best, religious attendance made absolutely no difference. And so, in other words, people who attended less, white Christians who attended less frequently, were just as likely to hold racist attitudes as those who attended more frequently. And if I just look at white evangelicals, the kind of group that I grew up in, it actually is quite remarkable that actually attending church more frequently made people hold more racist attitudes, right? So in other words, this relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as a white evangelical was stronger among high church attenders than it was among low church attenders. And I think this tells you just how deep this problem goes. Again, it's not just white evangelicals in the South, but it is white mainline that are more populous in the Midwest and the Northeast, and white Catholics who are even more urban, in the Northeast as well.
As you contend, this really,
and this is it. This is the priest of Mahan. That's who was teaching all these people to be against the Most High's chosen people. All these churches go back to the priests of Mahan. They've been the enemies of the Israelites. So that would make sense then that in their institutions, they were going to raise up whiteness. They're going to raise up white people against the Most High's chosen people. And then let me get this really fast. This helps us to understand. I'm going to read a little bit from the book of Mormon. We're going to read 1 Nephi 13. And we'll start at 4. And it came to pass. So again, 1 Nephi 13, verse 4. And it came to pass that I saw among the nations of the Gentiles the formation of a great church. And the angel said unto me, Behold, the formation of a church which is most abominable above all other churches, which slayeth the saints of God, yea, and tortureth them, and bindeth them down, and yoketh them with a yoke of iron, and bringeth them down into captivity. So this church is responsible for putting our people in bondage and killing them. So in order to do that, you're going to have to raise up a group of people like the churches have, how they made and then put down another group of people, which they've done. They put down the children of the Most High, and they raised up the so-called white man. Let me continue to 6. And it came to pass that I beheld this great and abominable church, and I saw the devil, that he was the founder of it. So it's going to be the devil that's going to be the founder of this church. So the views that you see from these Christian churches is the view of the devil. He raised up his people, and he put down the Most High's chosen people. So these people have a racist view against the Most High's chosen people. Let's continue. Number 7. And I also saw gold and silver, and silks and scarlets, and fine twined linen, and all manner of precious clothing. And I saw many harlots. There's your other little denominations and the little churches and everything else. And the angel spake unto me, saying, Behold, the gold and the silver and the silks and the scarlets and the fine twined linen and the precious clothing and the harlots are the desires of this great and abominable church. And that's exactly what's been happening. They've been after things this whole time. And the next part, 9. And also for the praise of the world do they destroy the saints of God and bring them down into captivity. So they've done all this for the praise of the world, for the praise of the other nations. That's why they have these racist points of view. That's why they've raised themselves up so that the rest of the world would worship them. And they've all come together to look down on the Most High's chosen people. That goes, and that's exactly what this guy was explaining right now with the racist points of views from these Christians, so-called people of God, who are still in these final days in 2020, trying to prove that Jesus was white. He wasn't Ish either.
It hasn't been a north-south kind of thing, that this has been a white Christian thing, north, south, east, and west.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, just quickly on this point, also read a fair amount of Frederick Douglass, working on the book. And one of the things that he was most dismayed about after the Civil War is, he basically writes that he thought the issue of slavery, that settling the issue of slavery, ending this practice, would have a great effect on people's attitudes around white supremacy in general. And he was dismayed that was not actually the case, that actually many whites saw slavery as one thing and white supremacy as something completely different. And one example I'll give, that's actually from the state of New York, is Charles Finney, who was a white Presbyterian minister, and he was a staunch abolitionist. And was, debated people on the issue of slavery, spent a lot of time organizing. And once that question was settled, though, he had a young protege who was approaching him about organizing an integrated worship service. And he stopped him in his tracks and he said, no, you misunderstand. The issue of abolition and amalgamation are not the same thing. And basically said, I'm for abolishing slavery. We are not for mixing the races, in this way, and was still hanging on to this. And I think that actually was also, for me, really important insight, that the Civil War did virtually nothing to settle the issue of white supremacy. The Civil Rights Movement did very little to settle the issue of white supremacy, and that we have really not reckoned with that underlying issue. We have, Baldwin talked about, the bill coming due, and we have not been willing to pay it. And I think here we are again. And
that's it. The bill coming due, and they're not willing to pay it. That's why the Most High is putting that bill to them right now. He's about to extract payment right now. That's what's going on right now. See, that's why they don't want to admit that all these issues that they're having, all these problems that they're having with the plague, the economy, everything falling apart around them, them trying to do vaccines, and all of a sudden nothing's working out. They don't have enough of them. This is all part of that bill that's due, that they're going to have to pay. They've been kicking the can down the road. Now there's no more road. Now it's time to pay the bill.
Many ways, with this another moment of reckoning, which is, I think, another moment of opportunity for us, really, to finally deal.
There is no opportunity. They want to deal with things on their own terms. They want to have a conversation, as they always say. But we know that that's not what's about to happen.
With these debts that we have incurred by not really being honest and telling the truth about how white supremacy has been with us, and being willing to commit to finally, excising it from our midst.
I've heard many people comment that maybe in the last, 4 months or so, particularly after the George Floyd case, that maybe white attitudes have changed. But I know that you've done some research since then, and maybe that's not the case.
Yeah, it's a really mixed bag. On the one hand, we did see in the early weeks after George Floyd's murder, white attitudes and white Christian attitudes actually being fairly positive on the Black Lives Matter movement, and much more so than they had been back in 2015, for sure. And even anecdotally, like I'm here in Maryland, just outside of DC, and I have a friend who's a pastor of a UCC church, and in 2015 he put out a Black Lives Matter sign on his church that got vandalized and burned 3 separate times. And I think that's not what we're seeing now. I mean, we're seeing much more acceptance and support, I think, even among predominantly white churches for the Black Lives Matter movement. But the more recent data that we've seen has shown that these gaps that I mentioned before are largely still with us. I mean, on the specific question of the killing of African Americans by police, for example, we are still seeing a 25 percentage point gap between white Christians of all kinds, again, not just evangelicals, who are majority saying these are just isolated incidents with a few bad apples. They're not part of a pattern. They're not part of systemic racism in the country. Whereas whites who are not Christian, strong majorities saying, no, these are part of a pattern, and agreeing with African Americans. And on the issues of Confederate flags and monuments, we're actually seeing attitudes move in really the wrong direction. In other words, white Christians are actually become more insistent that the Confederate flag and the Confederate monuments are actually just signs of Southern pride and not symbols of racism. And those attitudes have actually moved 5 or 6 points the wrong way. And then in just the last month, we've seen some slippage among whites overall, white Christians included, in support for Black Lives Matter. So we've seen some support go up over the summer, and in the last month, we've seen some of that taper off and flag a bit in the last few weeks. And
that's exactly why we need to keep praying to our Father. These people will not fix it themselves. That's why the Most High is sweeping them off the land, because they're not about justice. And he said it's all forms of Christianity. All forms of Christianity are part of the plague. And that's why we got to keep praying to the Most High. He's moving, and we're just praying that he continues to move and even accelerate his movement and getting these animals off of our land. Because they'll just make a little play for a little bit of time. Oh yeah, we care about you, and they're going to go right back to their racist views because they feel that they are better than. And that's why the Most High has to come and show them otherwise. All praise is to the Most High Yahweh. Acknowledgement to the earthly mother. Who is wisdom? Who is Holy Spirit? Acknowledge Yahweh Shai. Shalom.